Welcome to Supernatural Circumstances, the podcast where we take you down the rabbit hole into the fantastic world of the strange, the paranormal, and the unknown. I'm Morgan Knudsen.
Yes, you are, and I am Mike Browne, and it's time to dim the lights and settle in. Come along with us on this week's adventure, and we're talking about the Great Lakes this week with Chad Lewis, specifically Lake Superior.
Yeah, and what an adventure, because these are locations, I think, that don't really get addressed for whatever reason. There's a couple of books out there about them, but it's not something that people really talk about. I think when we think of water or bodies of water, you think of ships on the ocean and ghost ships and that kind of a thing. And really, a lot of these areas that are near bodies of water can be highly active with various types of activity, and legends grow around it. And I mean, it's really, really interesting.
Well, especially with the Great Lakes, and we'll get into the size of them here with Chad pretty soon.
We will, and I'm excited to delve into this a little bit because Chad, for people who have been with us a long time, know that he's quite the adventurer. And for the people who have not been with us and are just joining us, he is quite the adventurer. He's been everywhere. He's been all over the world, and he really gets boots on the ground to talk to everybody he possibly can, stays in these locations. He's not some, armchair investigator that lives vicariously through other people. Everything he does is really, really hands-on. He's kind of the Steve Irwin of parapsychology.
Without the crocodiles.
Without the crocodile and all the enthusiasm.
Right.
Well, I say let's get this party started because I'm excited to talk to him. Chad, it is always incredible to have you, and we are always so excited when you want to come back on the show because we know we're going to learn a ton, and you have incredible stories for us every single time we're here, so welcome back.
Greetings from the back roads of Wisconsin.
Back roads of Wisconsin and the Great Lakes, because that's what we're talking about today. You've got a new book that is coming out, and I am really stoked about it because there's not a whole lot of stories out there about this. Okay, tell us about your book and why you picked the Great Lakes. What's going on?
Sure, the book's coming out hopefully June 1st, if I survive that long, with all these curses on my head. But it's Supernatural Lake Superior, so it's going to cover everything weird and unusual from Minnesota up through Canada to Michigan and then back to my home state of Wisconsin.
That's crazy because there's so many stories around Lake Superior, first of all. I mean, for people who don't know, Lake Superior is considered one of the strangest locations, I think, in the U.S. and Canada, and which is a little surprising, I think, to most people because they think, well, when we think of strange things or hauntings, we think of things like back roads or haunted buildings or things like that, but this is a lake that's got a lot of history.
It really does, and I think a lot of people who have never been to Lake Superior or are not real familiar with it just don't realize how gigantic it is. It's basically an ocean. I mean, it's 350 miles long, 160 miles wide in volume alone. If you were to take Lake Superior and add up all the other Great Lakes, you'd have to throw in 3 more Lake Eries just to reach Superior. That's how gigantic this place is.
Oh, wow.
It's hard to get your mind around it, really. When we think of a lake, we think we can stand on one side and see the other, and that's just not the case with this place.
It's like an inland sea, really.
It really is, and people seem to be drawn to it, that when they go there, they feel like, I have to be here, I have to move here, or I have to vacation here every summer. I need to get back. It has this uncanny draw to it that just seems to lure people in, and they can't escape the mystique of it all.
Why do you think that is? What is it about this place? Because I think some places innately have that for people, maybe a lot more than others. What do you think that is?
For me, part of it is just the rugged shoreline of the lake. Growing up in Wisconsin, here in the United States, my favorite scenery from all my travels around the world is the Northwoods look. The shoreline of the granite rocks, the pine trees, the thick forest, the green offset with the blue of the water. And there's no place where that's more evident than Lake Superior. That every time I'm in Lake Superior on it, especially when I'm on the Canadian side, I think I could stare at this environment for the rest of my life and never get bored. It's my perfect type of environment. Some people would love to be in the desert or the mountain. For me, it's the Northwoods, and Lake Superior does it better than anywhere else.
I can definitely relate to that because I feel the same way. I've got a very strange draw to that type of setting, and like here in Alberta, I mean, we've got that pretty extensively, and same, Mike, with you in BC. There's an element of that wild where there's just mystery. I think that really hasn't been touched on too much, but we get little glimpses of what's there through people like you, Chad, who do the work, who go out and find these stories. So tell us one of the stories that really, really stood out to you. What was the first one that you thought, oh man, like there's something going on here that I just can't explain?
I should state that although I grew up 2.5 hours from Lake Superior, it wasn't until I was in college that I was finally able to explore the beauty of it. Had never been there prior to it. And of course, that was a while back, but I seem to have come across this book in parts. And what I mean by that is I was discovering more and more while I was working on other things. I was doing a book on Minnesota creatures, and part of Minnesota's North Shore, as it's called, runs from Duluth all the way up to Thunder Bay, Canada. And I was interviewing a woman who had spotted a UFO over Lake Superior in a small town called Two Harbors, Minnesota, just north of Duluth. And she was out just watching the lake with several other people, and they saw this craft out in the middle of the lake hovering. And your stereotypical UFO, flying, unidentified flying object out there. And she's watching it a bit and then looks over at the people that were there, and they're watching it. And then all of a sudden it's gone in a flash, just absolutely out of sight. And she wasn't really interested in UFOs, but she was excited because her son was a UFO enthusiast. So she wanted to go home and tell him all about her sighting, that finally, after all these years, she could share something that he was really interested in, her own personal experience. And she's walking back by herself. The other people that were there went their way. And as she's walking to her car, she said, 2 men in dark suits approached her. And she said they told her before she got to her car that they realized she had just seen a UFO and it would be better for her health if she just forgot all about it and never mentioned it again.
That's not ominous at all.
Well, this woman was amazed because not only had she not talked about it, she hadn't even got to her car yet. So she went home and told her son about it. And he said, Mom kind of looked at her as though she was crazy and said, Mom, that's your typical Men in Black story. And she had no idea what the Men in Black even were. So she obviously did tell me the story and told others, thankfully. So I should probably check in on her to make sure she's still around.
That's really interesting. And it goes to show the amount of phenomenon that's actually there. I mean, when we think about lakes, you kind of think of the typical maybe haunted shoreline or something, but that's not the case with Lake Superior. There is so much phenomenon going on there. What other cases and types of phenomenon have you heard about?
Well, I should say that the UFO stuff is ever present there. I've done lectures up and down the shoreline all over Lake Superior, and everywhere I go, people tell me of sighting weird light, sometimes in the sky, sometimes under the water, moving about where they can see it. And then it comes in and out of the water as though it's not even there.
Wow.
No ripple, no splash, no waves, nothing whatsoever. So these stories of UFOs, they become commonplace to me. And the people that I would interview, I was excited about it, but for them, it was just everyday life, that they would see it on their walks and just kind of dismiss it. So you have UFOs, you have stories of strange creatures from sea serpents to merpeople or mermaids, which is one of my favorite stories of all of Lake Michigan, is the story of a strange mermaid that was spotted just on the Canadian side of the lake.
Well, you're going to have to get into that.
Yeah, exactly. I need to know this story.
So this story takes us all the way back to the 1780s. And there was a French-Canadian trapper that was making his way along Lake Superior. And they were camped out near Thunder Bay in front of a place called Pie Island, which is just out a little bit. You can see it from Thunder Bay pretty well. And they were camped out there. They had an indigenous guide with them, a First Nations woman. And they were camped out when all of a sudden they looked out on a rock near the island. They saw what appeared to be a teenage boy, shirtless, dark skin. Don't know if it was heavily tanned or if more of just a naturally dark skin from the top half up, from the waist up. But on the bottom, it was your typical mermaid out of a Disney movie. You know, the fins, the tail, all reaching down. And this trapper thought, well, none of my friends and family are going to believe I've seen a mermaid. I better shoot this thing. You know, which was the thought back then of everything.
Yeah, right.
Not sure what this is, shoot it. Yeah. So raises his rifle up to shoot at this thing, and the indigenous woman kind of blocks the shot, so it goes off, doesn't hit, and she, you know, sternly warns him that these things have supernatural powers. We believe that these creatures can control the weather, among other things, that if you try to harm them or kill them, it will bring storms and terrible weather your way. And sure enough, for the next several days, they were trapped at camp from horrible weather that came in. And we know about this case because eventually it was covered in a Canadian magazine from the 1800s, 1824, 40 years later. But we know it was testified under oath in a Canadian court that this is what that man saw, a mermaid. And it's funny because we have stories of sirens in the water trying to entice ships and boaters to crash on the shores and that. And they were thought to control weather and be able to bring about storms. And the same thought was up in Canada of these mermaids being able to control it. And it's always funny because people always joke up there that know of the story that they don't mess with the mermaids because their weather is already fickle enough. They don't need to bring about any other storms or tragic weather. So we have the stories of the merpeople, which there was for one time kind of a parody website that showed a bunch of mermaid sightings on Lake Superior that were all hoaxed, of course, but having fun with the legend.
That's really interesting because you hear these stories of mermaids and whatnot, and I think the majority of people chalk it up to basically fairy tales that sailors would tell over the years. But that's a really interesting point that this guy felt so strongly about it that he actually testified to this and made it court record. Like, obviously he saw something that was the image. You know what I mean? Like, Mike, you and I, we've talked about this before, where people might have a label for something that they're finding the best reference that they possibly can.
Yeah, it's kind of typical of, you know, it's that whole idea about, we talk all the way back to flying saucers. Before the word flying saucer came into existence, people weren't seeing flying saucers, they were seeing something else, like all the way back to biblical times where Ezekiel saw a wheel in the sky kind of thing. So
it makes you wonder what it is. Like, in your opinion, Chad, what do you feel like he saw or could have seen? Do you think this is what it was?
I have no doubt that he saw what he described to have seen. That whether it was our traditional mermaid, a lot of times, especially with historic accounts, and I got into this quite a bit, and we talked about this last time I was on about the Wendigo, of how we're often white-splaining some of these stories,
right?
Or maybe future-splaining them now, where in the future here or in modern times, we look back and say, they must have been mistaken. They didn't know any better. This French pioneer moving about. What the heck did he know? He must have seen a seal or something in the water. But I really take these accounts for face value unless they give any reason not to. That these people observe it, they report that they saw it or spotted it. So what evidence would I have that they didn't?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's kind of how I've looked at a lot of this as well. And we probably one of the most glaring examples of that is the pyramids, where people are just thinking, well, there's no way that so much of this could have happened, or people could have seen this or done this or whichever. And we're finding more and more that no, this is what happened. Like this, they had things potentially like electricity and things like that, where before it was like, well, but these people they were too primitive to be able to, come up with any of this stuff. And it's like, I think we just have this tendency to dismiss so much of that. And like you were saying, Chad, with encounters like this, if you've got a culture that has been here a whole hell of a lot longer than we have, like we have discussed with the Wendigo, we really have to start to piece this out and take a look at this and maybe not dismiss it so quickly. So what else has been reported there? I know there's been things like ghost ships and stuff like that. What else have you heard?
One of my favorites, and one that I just recently learned about that is going to be right in all of our wheelhouses, is at Puckasaw National Park in Canada. It's about midway through the Lake Superior Loop. If you were to do an entire loop, it's about 12 o'clock on a clock, if you were. And I was there first time 20 plus years ago. And it's a national park, one of Canada's, and it's amazing, huge. And they have this 15-mile hike that gets you way out in the middle of nowhere. And I was there originally because a lot of Bigfoot and Sasquatch type sightings of creatures. And I recently went back this summer again to the national park because there had been a history of Wendigo sightings there that I had been unfamiliar with when I first went there the first time, that people were talking about not only encountering them, but one Wisconsin author back in the 1970s talked about actually battling a Wendigo at Puckasaw National Park.
Oh, wow.
So these stories are always flooding forward, even if you think you know a lot about these stories, which I think I know a few Lake Superior stories, but I'm still learning every single day of more stories, more legend, more folklore and superstition. So this was a story of a Wendigo being there. And once you're there and you see how desolate it is when you're out, 5 miles on the trail and you haven't seen anybody, there's no development, which I absolutely love the Canadian side of Lake Superior because there's really nothing there. A couple small towns, but there's no big tourist town, almost as though they don't want to take advantage of the tourism by destroying the beauty of the lake. You'll have a few mom and pop places to stay, but no big resorts, no cabins. So when you're out there and it starts to get cold and nasty and desolate, you can see how these legends of the Wendigo would sprout up.
Yeah, when I was reading a little bit about the lake and whatnot before today, and just in preparation for today, that was one thing that I came across as well. And I don't know whether it was the same story or not, but I was on Reddit and there was a bunch of people and it surprised me, there was a bunch of people that had written accounts of Wendigo kicking around there. And I was kind of surprised. And some of the people didn't know what it was that they saw. They were just saying, I was out there and I was on the trails and I saw something that looked really weird. And then when I, shone my flashlight on it, it was really, really weird. And they didn't name Wendigo. They just didn't know what they were looking at. And then of course people would comment and say, I wonder if this is what it was, so on and so forth. And I was surprised. Do you think that maybe some of the reason why there aren't as many tourist settlements and stuff like that in and around there on the Canadian side is maybe because people have a general understanding that there is something out there? Because in Canada, stuff doesn't get reported to anyone. People see something and then they just don't talk about it again. Do you think that maybe that might be why that people are just not setting up cabins out there?
There really seems to be a hush-hush of a lot of these stories on the Canadian side. And that was a bit interesting to research, because if you're trying to do this online, which a lot of people are these days, and that's it, you're not going to find basically anything.
No.
Which really propelled me to do this book, because when you're there and you start talking to some of the locals, the historians, people who have been there a while, that's when you discover these stories that never really, it's almost as though the internet doesn't exist there, because these stories have not spread unless you're in that region, unless you're stopping at the supermarket or chit-chatting at the grocery store or whatever you're doing. That's when these stories come out. But if you were just to try to find them by Googling or trying to find other books on them outside of ghost ships, you'll find nothing.
Yeah, there is nothing. I mean, when I first started even into the area of Dogman here in Alberta, I mean, there's literally zero on the internet, like nothing going on. Nobody's talking about it. And it wasn't until I actually started interviewing farmers, people in these remote areas, and people started coming forward saying, oh, yeah, one took out part of our sheep herd last year. And we had another guy come forward and say, yeah, my wife doesn't even want me talking about this, but I thought I'd relay my story to you. And part of the pack had been in their yard a number of times. And she was like, I'm not even going there. She was too terrified to talk about it. But it's interesting. It's like, there's just a completely different culture here of just not wanting to make waves, not wanting to stand out. They're happy to talk about their story, but they never ever want their name mentioned. So I can't imagine what it was like for you being here and trying to find the people that had these stories. Did people eventually start coming up to you and wanting to speak about it?
This seems to apply to anywhere in the world, that a lot of cultures just do not like talking about it, whether they think you won't take it seriously, or the fact that they believe when you start looking for the weird will come looking for you, and that by talking about it and giving it name, it will then be aware of you and come after you, sort of thing. But I think in Canada, like the rest of the world, when people start to see that you're sincere about it, that you respect the legend, that you take it seriously, I think they open up a little bit more to you, and they see that you're taking this in a manner that it should be addressed in. So I think that's very helpful. It's also helpful to be able to spend certain amounts of times at places that if you're just going into a town and you only have an afternoon, you might not get anywhere. But if you stay there for a couple days and people know, oh, you're staying at that hotel and you need to talk to my sister, you have a lot more time to spread out and really collect these stories. But for me, that's what was so important with this book, is because there wasn't a lot of stuff out there. Again, there's a ton of stuff on Great Lakes, ghost boats and ghost ships and haunted ships that have sunk on Lake Superior, hundreds of them. But outside of that, there's not a lot of stories of the haunted places on the shoreline, or the creatures, the sea serpents in the waters, the UFOs, and all sorts of other anomalies. And that's the kind of stuff that really intrigues me, that stuff where you really have to dig, you have to get out there and be at the spots, the stuff that's not easy to discover.
Well, you mentioned staying at some of these hotels. Was there anyone that really stood out to you? Because, I mean, there are some really interesting haunted places in and around that area. Did one in particular stand out, or a few of them stand out? What were your experiences?
Yes, I loved a place in my home state of Wisconsin, and it's in a very touristy area called Bayfield. It's one of our big tourist places in Wisconsin. And they have a Grunke's old hotel. It's the oldest standing hotel in Bayfield, which is saying something. And there's stories of it being haunted. And it's this old red building. If you get seasickness easily, you probably won't want to stay there, because the rooms are so sloped that you almost fall off the bed and start rolling down in the middle of the night, because nothing's up to code. It's just old school. And There's lots of stories of people seeing weird things there, that people will have catch something out of the corner of their eye and it looks like someone from the 1800s, but then it vanishes. And there's a female ghost that's particularly seen there that will knock on your door or rap on your window. But when you go to look, the room, is empty and the hallway's empty. And I collected a lot of these stories, but while we were staying there, we were interviewing a lot of the staff, the owner and their staff. And then we went out to the lake for the day to look for sea serpents and that, and came back, and the door to get to the entrance where all the hotel guests, there's like 10 rooms maybe, the door that the hotel people use was locked, and they don't give you a key because it's never locked, but yet we were locked out. So ended up, this was maybe only 10 o'clock at night, ended up calling the owner, and she thought we had been drinking all night because she said, no, I'm the only one with the key to lock that door. It never locks. Go up there. What are you doing? Are you sure you're doing it right? What have you been drinking type of thing? And said, no, this is Wisconsin, but we weren't drinking. And eventually she pulls herself out of bed, comes to the door, and sure enough, it was locked. And she said it was impossible. And she kind of chalked it up to the spirits of the hotel locking us out. So I thought that was an interesting coincidence that maybe just she had lost her mind and had locked it, but she was pretty adamant she hadn't.
Oh, people's explanations for interesting experiences. We always tend to just, brush it off like, oh, it had to have been something explainable. Well, not always. And I like the paranormal explanation. Thank you very much. This is so interesting. Like, there's so many cool places to stay, but not only is there places to stay inside, there's also lots of places to stay outside. And one of the stories that you cover is the Trowbridge Falls Campground in Thunder Bay. Did you want to talk about that a little bit? Because if you don't want to stay in a hotel and you stay safe, you can always hang around outside and see what happens.
Oh dear.
Mike's already on this one. I love the outdoor places. I love places where you might go where help is nowhere to be found. If something were to happen, both natural or supernatural, you twist an ankle, help's not going to arrive. You might not have cell phone service, or if you encounter a creature. And what I love about the Trowbridge campground is just coming into the campground, there are tons of sightings, tons of signs, saying, keep your kids close because panthers and cougars are on the prowl. So right away, it's got my attention as being a cool place. Yeah. Keep your pets and your kids close because, well, we're not liable for that. But yeah, there's stories of spirits walking through the campgrounds and on the hiking trails. Sometimes they're indigenous looking. Other times they look like they're from the 1800s wearing a period costume, like there's some tour guide, but yet they vanish right before people's eyes. But what I love about this one is the stories, the origin of them are really unknown. There's no tragic report of people being murdered there or suicide or untimely deaths or accidents or anything unsavory there. It's just the place itself seems to be a place of history and mystery. And outside of the panthers and the mountain lions, you have to watch out for the spirits as well.
What I always find really interesting about these hot spots is that they all tend to, as we've talked to other people, Mike, so many times, like when we had Mike Ricksecker on for the Alaskan Triangle, or Brandon Elvis, we talked about the Kentucky Triangle and all of these interesting locations. And Lake Superior seems to be another one where there seems to be this consistency in what people are reporting and seeing. And the story you just told me, Chad, reminds me quite a lot of phenomenon that we've talked about a lot of times on the show here that our audience will be familiar with, which is place memory, where there seems to be a recurrence or recording of events that seem to just be replaying, like these apparitions that are showing up and things like that. And usually there's some semblance of like atmospheric or environmental condition that predates that or is a bit of a precursor to that, which makes me wonder, like, what is it about this area specifically that seems to be drawing some of this phenomenon? Like, this seems to be this sort of overarching theme of this place being really, really active. Has there ever been anything or any studies done about the actual area? Like, what the heck is going on?
I am not aware of any supernatural type studies or any studies looking at the geography of the land of the place itself. Like, is there a pole there? Is there some reason this is a place, a portal or a window area, if you will? Yeah. Other than the fact that almost everybody who visits Lake Superior can feel it. They get the idea that they're home. This is where they should be. And of course, there's so much healing with just being in any nature. Whether you're out in your local town park or if you're out on a hike in the middle of nowhere, just being around nature makes you feel better. But there's something on another level about Lake Superior. And I would love to see somebody do more research and study into, is there something to it being a portal area or a window area? Or is there some other explanation that why we're drawn to this lake especially? Because I love all the Great Lakes, but none of them in my mind competes with Lake Superior.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like these locations that just seem to have, I don't know, just more connection to something that's bigger than us. And like I think you touched on something really important, which was, of course, just being in nature is something that allows us to, and maybe I'm answering my own question here, actually, it really allows us to be reconnected with that deeper part of ourselves and allows us to be still. It allows us to connect with sort of that non-physical consciousness and whatever. Maybe there's something to that aspect of it, that feeling that people are getting of feeling home, feeling chilled out and relaxed, that is actually allowing people to experience more of this phenomenon in the area. Because like, as we all know, I'm preaching to the choir, I know, but as we all know, that relaxation really does play a role in the amount of phenomenon often that people are experiencing. So maybe, I don't know, I'll leave you guys to throw some input on that, but I wonder if that might I wonder if that might have something to do with it.
I can certainly jump in. Certainly. I think so, because this isn't a new thing happening, that the indigenous people, some of the first people there, the First Nations people, and then later the French explorers, the missionaries, the fur traders, a lot of them would set up camp along Lake Superior. And there are a lot of better places to set up camp than along Superior. There are better water places, better fishing. Superior has terrible weather that can turn at any moment. So it's a harsh environment that you'd find a better place. But yet people were setting up encampments there. They were setting up villages and towns, and tribes would be there because there was something there about it that they could have easily found a better water supply, better fishing, and so on and so on and so on. But there was some draw that they understood it hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And it's something where I don't know if we've lost that understanding or if we're just slower to regain it. But it is something that when you're there, it's undeniable.
What it kind of reminds me of is, so there's been a couple of TV shows that I've done over the years where people have asked me about haunted places like burial grounds and cemeteries and so on and so forth. And the one thing that I've always said to them is that it's not the fact that there's a cemetery or burial ground or something like that there, but that people realized that there was something special about the area and then made that something special. They then used that space for putting to rest loved ones or things like that. And this to me just screams of that, where it's again, people felt something first, like there's something special about this place, and then being able to then move in and turn it into something that is unique and special. You talk a lot in the book also about Two Harbors, Minnesota, which I thought was really interesting. You've got both Split Rock Lighthouse there and you talk about Two Harbors itself. Can we talk a little bit about that? Because that seems to be somewhat of a hotspot too.
It really is. Not only was it where the Men in Black were sighted, but we have kind of on both sides going up the North Shore. On the south side, you have a haunted lighthouse of the Two Harbors. And then north of that, you have the Split Rock haunted lighthouse as well. But also one of my favorite sea serpent stories came from Two Harbors. A man was in town doing errands for the day, and he was just watching the water, beautiful, gorgeous day, and he sees what he thought was a dolphin out in Lake Superior. And he's thinking to himself as he's watching this thing come up and down, he's thinking, I don't recall any stories of a dolphin in Lake Superior. And as he's watching closer, he gets a better look and he realizes it's not a dolphin or dolphins floating around. It's the large fin of a sea serpent, like Loch Ness monster looking creature. And at that point, he can see it's a big size, 20 to 30 feet long, and it's coming in and out of the water like your typical lake monster. And he's trying to scramble to get his phone or a pair of binoculars, something to get a better look at this thing. And then all of a sudden it descends into the depths of the lake and he lost track of it or it never reappeared. And he was convinced he had seen your traditional Loch Ness monster type sea serpent in the lake. And he wasn't out there looking for it. He wasn't out there trying to capture it. He simply was going about his day-to-day business. And I found that to be the case over and over and over, that the overwhelming majority of witnesses I spoke with were not out actively searching for these things.
Yeah.
They just happened to be in the right or wrong place at the wrong time, or the right time, if you will. And some of them don't even believe in these stories. So many of them would say, now, I don't believe in a Bigfoot, but this is what I saw run in front of my car, and that's the truth. So I found that fascinating, that it seemed as though the mere act of not looking for it brought it more likely for you to experience it.
That seems to be the way it is with this stuff. I mean, even in, just to nerd out on parapsychology for a second, that's what has been found even academically over the years, is that when people are in that state of relaxation and are not seeking something, because as soon as you start looking for something, your present awareness is that it's not there. You have to go look for it. So typically in many of these cases, I think that's what it is that if you're actively looking for something, then you're in this sort of vibrational state where you're going, well, it's not here. And that's what seems to keep coming up. And I think with here's an example, like even something simple, like, okay, I've lost my keys, and you're looking everywhere, can't find your keys. Oh, well, I guess I can't find my keys. Suddenly you give up and your keys show up. And I kind of think that this is similar, where you've got this, when you're in that relaxed state, you get to experience more. Your awareness, you kind of let go a little bit more. Remote viewers have a easier time when they're in meditation and super chill and relaxed than people who are, their brain's busy. I think we see this over and over and over again in different phenomenon. And to be in a park, like we were mentioning before, and already be in that relaxed state, it kind of makes sense that if you're not looking for it, boom, you're probably going to see it.
And I always heard stories around the lake of people scouring the lake with their binoculars looking for oddities, and then when they take a break and grab a peanut butter sandwich for lunch and set the binoculars down and relax, all of a sudden something happens, or you put your camera down and that's when it happens. And I think you really touched on an important part of, I travel a lot on the road lecturing, and I really am interested in highway hypnosis, where once you start driving and you don't have your radio on, you don't have a podcast going, although you should play this one. But when you're done with this one, when you let your mind wander, I found that that's when some of my best ideas come. And they've always talked about that from artists, whether they're musicians or, singers, that all of a sudden get their best idea while they're in the shower doing nothing. So there is something about letting your mind wander. And then I think you bring in the addition of the supernatural angle, where it seems like this trickster type stuff happens when, as soon as you turn your back or you take a moment of rest. Yeah. I think that there's a lot to that.
Well, I'll tell you a funny story. This happened, and this is sort of a good story to tell. It's actually so people who have followed me for a really long time know that I co-founded Entity Seeker with Stephanie Wirtz, who passed away quite a while ago now. But it's actually her birthday today on February 27th, and so I'm going to repeat this story for that reason, and also because this is exactly what we're talking about. One of the first places that she and I were called into to look at and investigate was this historic home here in Edmonton, and it was kind of well known in and around the park for its haunted things going on, the different poltergeist activity and things like that. And we had quite an adventurous night at this house, and it was really just the photographer who was with us caught some bizarre photos. We heard footsteps and people running up and down on the stairs and above us, and there's nobody above us. This is a tiny, tiny little historic house. And we had just been getting ready to leave. We'd packed everything up, and we were standing there. Steph's at the door. She was sitting right beside the door. I can visualize it to this day. I'm looking at her, and I said, you know what'll happen as soon as we're ready to leave? And she was like, what's that? And right beside her, there was a little sort of table where you'd put your keys and stuff like that. And they had tin can phones, the old tin can phones attached with the string, sitting on this little table. And I said, I swear to God, that's right as we're leaving, when our cameras are packed up, that's when something's going to happen. And I kid you not, within 5 seconds of that coming out of my mouth, we watched these tin can phones fly about 4 feet off the table right between us, right in front of Steph. They crash land on the floor, and all the cameras are put away. There's just nothing to record this. We all stood around and saw it, and there are these cans on the floor, and it was just such a great example of what you were just talking about. We just burst out laughing. We thought it was just hilarious, but it is always when stuff is put away, when you're relaxed, when stuff's just everything's chilled out, the stuff starts happening every freaking time.
Yep.
I had a colleague. That's a great story. I had a colleague that was experiencing similar things. So he would get calls from families about haunted activity at their house, and they would say it's been going on for the last week, every night straight, just nonstop. And he would get there and set up all of his gear and start doing his research, and nothing would happen. And just time after time, where eventually he started trying to blend in with the family, where he would discreetly put up the equipment, but if the family was sitting having a drink with a movie, he'd do the same thing with them, trying to make it as natural as it could be. And I remember years ago when the Mutual UFO Network would start giving alleged abductees, people who believed they were being, taken by alien type beings, they would give them these, what looked like a jewelry box and it would have all these monitors on it, trying to pick up sound recordings, any type of radiation. But what was interesting for them is that they had a kill switch on the back of it, that they told the abductees that this is the switch on and off. So turn it on when we give it to you, and it will just monitor stuff just hidden, kind of. It won't be a big camera sitting out. So if anything were trying to manipulate it, it wouldn't know it was anything more than a jewelry box. But the fun thing is that kill switch had no bearing whatsoever. But what they found is that in the middle of the night, when these events were said to be happening, the abductees would often go to the back and turn it off.
Really?
Thinking that they were turning it off. And, they have no recollection of doing it and no idea. But it had no effect. The thing was still recording, but it would record that it was meant to be turned off. And I was just fascinated. I wish they were still doing those. Maybe they are. I haven't researched MUFON for quite some years now.
That gives me chills. That's very disturbing.
Yeah, almost as though they were told to go turn it off and thinking because they thought it really would turn it off, they went along.
Yep, that creeps me right out. I don't know. I don't know about you guys. I mean, that's a little disturbing. But yeah, very, very interesting. So yeah, you have to ask the question, is it the person's subconscious that's doing that, or is there something else that's actually directing them to shut that off? That's really interesting. So that kind of brings the question, if people are coming to Lake Superior, they hear this episode, which thousands of people, of course, are going to hear this episode. What would you where do people start with this place? Because I know there's going to be a lot of people, especially living around the area, that are going to be like, okay, we want to go experience this ourselves. Where would you start if you were approaching this lake? Where did you start?
Yeah. I started doing pieces and bits of it. For years, I would go to a certain spot and be able to have maybe a weekend there and then have to go back. And then eventually I started expanding that, where I would do the entire loop, and I would do that every few years. And that was important for me because you really get a feel of the lake when you can do the entirety of it. But I always recommend that people start out with something they love, whether if they like going to beaches, there are plenty of beaches on the lake. If you like going to look for sunken ships, there are places you can see them basically from the shoreline. If you like the scenery of the Northwoods, go to that spot. If you like lighthouses or waterfalls or historic hotels, that's the easiest way to put your foot, dip your toe in the water, so to speak, because then you're doing something you enjoy. So if nothing happens, which hopefully supernaturally it will, but if nothing happens, you're still exploring the lighthouse you've always wanted to see. You're still spending the day at the beach if that's what you love. So I think that's the best way to experience it. Get your bearings, and then you can always expand from there. I think sometimes in today's society, we feel like if we can't dive in and do a month trip along the entire route, then what good is it going for a weekend at a certain area? You're not going to get to see a lot of it, but that's the way things start. Nobody ever just jumps in and, starts walking the entire world.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And especially in places like Canada, you just can't do anything in a day here.
No,
you really can't. Yeah, Mike, I mean, we really experienced that when you and Jason Hewlett came out last year. Yeah, you want to talk about that a bit and just the level of driving that
I mean,
we did.
In the weekend, I mean, how many miles did we cover? We drove hundreds of miles, hundreds of kilometers. It was just crazy. Canada is so massive, and we didn't leave Alberta.
No. Well, I mean, you can drive here for days and not leave a province. Mm-hmm. I mean, Ontario specifically. I mean, you can drive for 4 days and still be in Ontario. So I think you can't really do this without piecing things out very, very carefully. And Chad, I think you touched on something really important that Steph and I hammered on in all of our lectures for years, which was do not lose the fun. Do not lose the joy, because the joy and keeping your energy in that space is actually something that I have found very conducive to having things actually happen. When Steph and I stopped being stoic about things and we actually let go and had fun, we had a plethora of stuff happen in any place that we went to. But it was a matter of just letting go, stop being so damn serious about it, and find that joy again. I think that's spot on.
One thing I learned early when I started researching this 30 years ago, this field, is that I, like a lot of people, naively thought, oh, this is going to be easy. I'll get in, I'll explain why this is happening and figure out this case. And when you start to realize that, at least for me, that wasn't happening, that I quickly shifted to seeing it as the adventure of it all. And I had many of my colleagues that started out when I did, they burned out because they would often go to these places and it was work for them. They might not experience something, and it was for them a wasted trip. Whereas if I'm out somewhere traveling and nothing supernatural happens, I've stopped at 5 roadside attractions. I've seen something I've never spotted. I met some interesting people where I see the adventure, the folklore of it all. And I think that's what keeps me going after all these years and not burning out by the fact of just listing whether or not something happens supernaturally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's having that connection, I think, that is so important, and remembering that this is what it's about. Just because what we expect doesn't happen the way we think it's going to happen doesn't mean there hasn't been a point. And sometimes I think we get so wrapped up in phenomenon having to show itself in one specific way that we miss all the other things that we're supposed to be experiencing along, like what you said, Chad, that journey. Sometimes the lesson isn't in the thing that we have pigeonholed it into. Sometimes it's in something else that's coming. And I think if we sort of block that out on some level, and we've got this vision in our head and it's got to go that way, well, typically the universe doesn't have that plan. It's usually got something else going on. And if you let go, stuff can happen that it's just will completely blow your mind. I mean, I've had that happen I don't know how many times, and it's always better than what I think should have happened.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And if I were to give any piece of advice about Lake Superior, this would relate to us Americans, that you have to get up to the Canadian side of the lake, because you might be from Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota and say, I know the Northwoods. We have them in our state. I've seen them. Why would I go to the Canadian side? When you get to the Canadian side and you realize this is the Northwoods. We were the opening act for this, because it blows your mind that it's so big and so sparse and there's so much there. You're driving, if you drive an hour along the northern side of Lake Superior in Canada, you'll pass 100 different spots where in the US you would stop and stare at it all day because it's so gorgeous and so beautiful, where again, in 60 miles, you'll pass 100 of these to the point where you say, this whole place is majestic. So that would be one piece of advice for us Americans, is get to the Canadian side and you'll quickly realize that, your Northwoods that you thought was this gigantic spot is more like a little park in your neighborhood.
Yeah, it's another world. It really is a completely other world. And Mike and myself, we've lived in different parts of Canada for our whole lives. Mike, you're Maritimes and now in Vancouver, and I've been in Alberta and Vancouver and whatnot, and done most of my shooting and stuff for shows and whatever has been in Ontario. And I've had friends all over the place. And it's a completely different world with a completely different vibe here, and I mean paranormally, supernaturally. It's got a very different energy, and it's really a different adventure, and I completely concur. I think people need to branch out and realize what's here, because it's pretty cool. And I don't mean just the weather. There is that. But this has been amazing, Chad. Thank you so much for coming in and doing this with us.
Yet again.
Talk a little bit about this book, everything, title, where they can find you, and where people can begin their journey on this, because you've got some amazing books out that can really get people started.
I like to joke that this book is going to ghost ship out on June 1st. So you can, So you can pre-order it on my website, of course. But as I mentioned, just get out there. There's no real set way to do this. And I think sometimes people are dissuaded when they don't have thousands of dollars of equipment to go and research this stuff. Just get out there, have fun, explore. You will not regret it. You will not be on your deathbed saying, man, I really hated that Lake Superior trip I took.
Yeah, those of us who have thousands of dollars worth of equipment need to get out more too.
Yes, exactly. We do.
Well, that I think really sums it up. And I think being present, just to kind of like add my last 2 cents to this is that sometimes it's putting the camera down that will allow you to experience what you're supposed to experience. Just sort of a quick offhand note about that. There's a place that I visit semi-frequently in the spring and the fall that here in Alberta it's got a lot of stuff going on. And interestingly enough, when I bring the cameras, very little happens. And when I don't bring the cameras, it's almost like whatever's there understands that I'm there to be present with it, and stuff starts to go on like flawlessly every single time. So sometimes it's about just putting the camera down and just finding that presence, because it's amazing. So thank you so much, Chad, for doing this again. This is going to be out in a number of weeks, and this has just been awesome. So we so appreciate you.
Thanks again, and keep an eye out.
As usual, another interesting chat with Chad. He's a funny guy. I really like him. I hope one day we get to hang out IRL.
Oh gosh, I know. Every time we have him on, I enjoy it. And I've known Chad for a really, really long time. We've done projects together, and he's just such a plethora of information, and you don't realize just how much information he's got until you start talking about a subject, and within seconds he's spouting more information than you and I put together. It's
right.
Unbelievable.
Well, and he's generous with it too. He helped me with my book, Strange, Spooky, and Supernatural. He talked to me about the Van Meter Visitor, and also put me in contact with a bunch of people. So Chad is the man, in my opinion. He really is.
Oh, I totally agree. I mean, he did the foreword for my book, The Gift of Instinct, as well. And I just have always loved the amount that he has invested in the community, especially his library programs. You guys out there, if you keep in touch with him, chadlewisresearch.com, or follow him on social media, he does free presentations all the time. And sometimes they're online, sometimes they're in person. But like you were saying, I mean, he is so generous with the knowledge, and really, really believes that it's meant to be shared, which is something that I really hold dear as well. I think this stuff is meant to be discussed. And when you've got a reach like Chad does, he can make such an impact. And this particular case, the stories around Lake Superior, for me, it's bringing focus not only to an area that maybe doesn't get talked about, but it's something that brings focus to just, I think, both countries. Here we've got, Canada and America that are both, sort of butting up against each other right now. And it's really, really nice to turn around and have such a great conversation about a common location.
And it's interesting how these stories, they don't have to respect a border. You know what I mean?
No.
It's like, yeah, there's, a cryptid or a poltergeist, whatever it is that we end up talking about. These things, they don't know the difference between the U.S. and Canada. They're just living in a lake,
It's just such a human concept.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's such a human concept. And it brings me back all the time to this sort of overarching idea of consciousness. And what we talk about here on the show is that this is really a worldwide phenomenon. It's not something that is located to one place or another place. There's plenty of provinces and states out there that sort of try to make a claim that, this is where that came from, and this is the origin place of such and such and whatnot. Mm-hmm. But when you really dig into it, this stuff is going on everywhere, and everybody's got a different label or a story about it, and they might call it a different thing, but in the end, it's people having these incredible experiences, and it doesn't really matter what walk of life you're from or where you were born or anything like that. This is something we're all connected by. But yeah, what I really love about this, just in general, I think, is this is something everybody can come together on. And, that's the one thing about Chad's work that I really, really love, is he always takes the standpoint of being the student of
these stories, and now he's kind of become a steward of these stories, and which is a massively important person or role to have within the communities in general. I mean, throughout the ages, the knowledge keeper, the storyteller, has been somebody that people revere and are very, very respectful of. And I think he's just one of those people. And so delving into something like this, I'm hoping that everybody out there, whether you're on the American side or you're on the Canadian side, that you guys can just sort of grab onto this and get your minds going in a new way.
Well, we'll have Chad back, I'm sure. He just keeps turning up like a bad penny, that guy.
That's I'm sure that's what he's going to want to hear when he listens to this episode. Chad, you're a bad penny.
He knows we love him.
He totally does. Well, he better. He should now.
Well, thank you, Chad, and thank you, dear listeners, for joining us on this eerie expedition.
And remember, there is no line between the natural and the supernatural. All is consciousness. Until next time, stay curious, friends.
Supernatural Circumstances is a co-production of Entity Seeker Paranormal Research and Teachings and Good Egg Studios. This podcast is part of the Curious Cast podcast network. Theme music by Corey Johnson of Catalyst Records in Edmonton, Alberta. You can learn more about Morgan Knudsen at entityseeker.ca and learn more about me, Mike Browne, and listen to my show, Dark Poutine, at darkpoutine.com. Feel free to email the show at supernaturalcircumstances@gmail.com.